In this video, you will learn everything your startup needs to know about PostHog, including the pricing, how it works with all these different products, and if PostHog is a good fit for what you're trying to build. I have helped more than 100 founders like you figure out their startup analytics, and PostHog is one of my favorite tools. I want to show you where it really shines and where it has some limitations. I'm going to switch over here to the PostHog website. You can see here that we have 34 apps. How do we make sense of it? First, you can notice here that they're actually talking about 10 paid products and then dozens of other tools that are typically free to use. And then they break out their tools into the 4 categories: the product engineering tools, the analytics, data visualization tools. Then we have automation AI. A lot of these are new tools the last couple of years. And then we have the data stack. Let's look at the analytics portion first. The web analytics, this is really a competitor to something like Google Analytics 4. If we were to open it, we would see the kind of very typical web analytics metrics out there. We can get page views, visitors, sessions, session duration. It can be made privacy friendly, that is without cookies. Then we have product analytics, which would be more the competitor to something like a Mixpanel or Amplitude. We're going to have funnel reports, cohort analysis, a kind of breakdown of events or actions, user paths, correlation analysis, which you can use statistics, stickiness to understand how often users are coming back. Then we're going to let's look at revenue analytics. This is closer to perhaps what a ChartMogul is, where you take revenue data and then you create metrics of it. You may see monthly recurring revenue over time, or total number of active subscriptions, or customers, or payments. We have LTV, average revenue per user. Again, typically this data has to come from a transactional source. So we see Stripe here, and depending on what you use to capture transactions, this may be easy to set up or a little more difficult. I won't go through everything here. I will note, for example, group analytics, which is kind of listed out here differently. Many tools offer this. It's a Mixpanel Amplitude off the top of my head, which means you take your users and you put them under groups like an organization, and then you can analyze the organization as a whole or go down to the user level. So Mixpanel and Amplitude will not talk about this as an individual product, but they will talk about it as an individual feature. I think that's kind of helpful to understand what we're seeing here. On the product engineer, we have things like Session Replay, which would be a competitor to something like Full Story or Hotjar. We have experiments, feature flags, tracking for errors. Something like Firebase, for example, can track for errors for you. Then under data visualizations, we have what are basically reports. Again, not necessarily products or apps. I think it's the language that we were seeing here when we look at the menu, browse all apps. Then on the communication side, we have surveys and user interviews, which I believe this is actually still in beta, what they call work in progress. Then we have some extra add-ons, notebooks, for example, just a place to present data. User profiles, again, you'll be able to track data by user profiles. Let's actually go to the very top. We have automation, we have webhooks, workflow. We have some LLM that can live on top of the data. And then I think we skipped the data stack at the beginning. We have managed data warehouses for you. You can take data in and out, so you have some kind of ELT process. SQL editor, we have the reverse, which is also becoming very popular, where you can take data from your data warehouse into PostHog. Just want to underline the idea that the apps here are sometimes called futures or just reports and other tools. But nonetheless, even if we take into account, there are lots of things that PostHog can do in a single product. And you may not use all of it, but you do have all these possibilities of where you go and what you can do with it, which I think is one of the strongest features of PostHog. If one day you need like reverse ETL, even though maybe right now you have no idea what you do with it, that is something that you can then add later on in the future without necessarily buying another tool. Let's look at how we can get data into PostHog. How can we start to make use of some of this app? First, we need something like a tracking plan. This is a Google Sheet. You can do this in Excel. You can do this in Google Doc. I actually think PostHog has an app too where they do some data planning you can do there. This tracking plan, I'll post a link here in the description if you want it. But when we look at some of the events and properties and user properties that we want to pass, every event is an action that users can take in your app. For example, they may make a purchase, they may view a page, they may download a file, they may start a meditation. For example, here we have the sign-up event when they create their account. And then we have event properties that give us more information about that specific action. For example, we may say, where did it take place? On what platform? iOS, Android, or web. Maybe the date when this user was created, because then we're going to use that created date in a bunch of other places. Maybe it'll capture PII like name and email. Keep in mind that PII is typically not required to make tools like PostHog work. And you can just double check your PII requirements on your end to see if it makes sense to pass it. Then we might have a user ID, what PostHog calls a distinct ID. So we pass all those things as event properties. Again, give us more color to what this action was. As another example here, we have the watch video, and then we have a bunch of properties that tell us what were the hashtags associated with this video, or what percent of the video was watched, or what category was the video in, and so forth. Then we have user profile properties that give us more detail about the user himself or herself. Some things may be almost duplicate of the event properties. What platform is this user on? When was the user created? Then we might have some behavioral user profile properties here, like how many videos they have watched all time, or maybe last 30 days, or whatever it may be. Also want to note that PostHog will capture some events for you. You can capture interaction like clicks, taps, navigation like page views or screen views on mobile, copy and paste actions. We have the heat maps, dead clicks, and this is supported across the web, iOS SDKs down here. And you can disable it or enable it or tweak it. Maybe you only want certain parts of the auto capture. The auto capture can be really helpful to get started. You can get a bunch of data quickly. It may be too much data. You can pare it down, or you can track your own custom events if you want more flexibility. Your tracking plan, you simply want to list the 10 or 20 major actions that you want to track in your product. Then you want to note which ones may already be captured by the auto capture functionality, and then prioritize the rest using some kind of priority P1, P2 or something. And some events, let's say you want to capture this login event. This event may have to be implemented on the web, iOS, and Android SDKs to have complete parity across all your platforms. And the event name will be the same across all three platforms. So it would be called login, and the event properties will be the same. Do not do something like this, login web or login iOS, unless you have a very good reason. We keep the events global, and then there's some kind of event property that then allows us to drill down and say how many people logged in on iOS, how many on Android, how many on web. That kind of gives you the data that you would need at the specific level of segmentation while still keeping your data clean. You end up with 10, 15 events that capture all these global actions and capture all the things that you care about. There's a quick checklist I built here that might be helpful. And then if you're tracking data issues, I have this tracker. Once you have your tracking plan, then if we want to figure out SDKs, PostHog has quite a bit of SDKs. A lot of them are pretty standard. We're going to have the mobile SDKs like Android, we have iOS, we have Flutter, we have React Native earlier, or React Native here, and React. Then we have the web, which JavaScript web. We're going to have some backend libraries, maybe like Node.js could be technically a backend library, Java, Python. We also have an API that can be used. So if you have a backend that's not supported here from an SDK perspective, you can just use the vanilla API and then post data into it, and the developer can help you figure all this stuff out. We can see that all the SDKs support event capture and user identification. Those are the events, event properties, and user profile properties we just saw. And then the support for things like auto capture varies depending on the SDK. Session recording, the feature flags, the group analytics, and the error tracking also vary. Let's look at the JavaScript web SDK here for a second. Every SDK is a little bit different, but you typically have to add the SDK to your app. On web, you just copy and paste in some snippet of code, and your settings will technically give you the correct API key, and the API host are the two things we look for. So here's the key, and here's the API host. And then there are some defaults here that you may want to change if needed. And then when you want to capture events, here's, for example, the event capture of an event called user signed up. And if we want to send event properties, we can do the same event and just simply pass the event properties underneath. And again, this is all very similar across the different SDKs. When we identify users down here, we pass an ID into PostHog. Ideally here, we're passing a persistent ID, let's say from your product database, that will not change. You may pass some PII, as we see here, email and name, if this is something that you need and that aligns with your privacy requirements. One thing I want to know here is there is a difference between identify events and anonymous events. And this does play a role into the pricing, where anonymous events are typically 4 times cheaper than identify events. Typically, your website will be a lot of anonymous events. And once a user logs in or creates an account, those are all identify events. That's the break point in your app that you can think about for the split. Now, a strategic point for you to think about for your startup is client SDKs, the JavaScript, the iOS, and Android are typically faster to implement compared to backend SDK, and they will collect a bunch of information for you out of the box. We have not talked about things like geographic data, country, region, and city, or device data, the device name, like is it the iPhone, what version it is. We have browser name. And backend is the case, will not do it out of the box. You tend to have to pass it. So you have to be able to pass an IP address or a user agent or something that then the backend SDK parses into the correct properties. Backend SDKs are typically more reliable. They're not susceptible to ad blockers and other privacy limitations, but they just take a little bit more effort. So you think about your implementation, you might have this 80% client, 20% backend to start. And over time, that might become 20% client, 80% backend as you get a better feel for the data and what events are important to your startup. And as long as we keep the event names the same, we can just change the source of SDKs. Now let's jump into pricing here. The first thing I'll note is that this is the PostHog Cloud. There is an open source version you can run of PostHog, and it is maintained. Now PostHog themselves recommend that the open source version, which is right here in the GitHub, only really makes sense to about 100,000 events per month, after which they recommend migrating to the PostHog Cloud. I'm sure you can try to push it beyond 100,000 events. I'm actually not quite sure what would happen after 100,000 events. Maybe it'll just become sluggish. And then once you're ready, you can then move on to the PostHog Cloud. PostHog notes that about 90% of the customers do not pay for PostHog. They are actually in the free plan. You can see here that the free plan will give you 1 million events. Then the 5K session recordings. We have the future flags. We have data warehouses, data pipelines, and then they give you the breakdown of what each resource costs. And then down here, they do have a handy calculator where you can then get a sense of what this might look like if you were to have, for example, 10 million product analytics events, and then maybe, let's say, 5 million anonymous events. This is just a website. You may want to add a mobile app. You may have API events. This will be the backend events we talked about. And then you can go forth and then start to add the different products as you need. For example, here is the PostHog AI. You get 2,000 credits initially, but maybe you want more credits over time. And there's a bunch of other add-ons you may need. And then you get a sense of what your estimated total is here. Ooh, let's go back. And what this might cost you on a monthly basis. And you can then kind of take this calculator URL and share it with your team. They do have discounts for startups and nonprofits. You can see here a quick note that if you raise less than 5 million and you're less than 2 years old, you may want to check out the startup program, and you get a bunch of other credits here that may help you get started with PostHog. I want to give you a quick overview of the dashboard just before we finish this section here. Once you start having data, there'll be a bunch of charts that get pre-created for you. Let's move on to product analytics, where in this case, we can see very simple funnel I built, where you can see the rough interface where you have your events, whatever events you're tracking. You can then do filters. You can do renaming or do some other logic here for specific events. Then if we have just trends, we can do different filters to understand what are the different trends here and then run the reports. The PostHog interface is not as sophisticated as what you may see there. Just the sheer amount of options you might have in a mixed panel or amplitude. But as a place to be able to understand your data and have all these things around you, it's kind of hard to beat, even if perhaps a tool like Mixpanel may give you more options for how to analyze your data. Here's Web Analytics. Web Analytics is what would be the closer competitor to something like a Google Analytics 4, and we get a bunch of things out of the box. The interface is not complex. It does take a second to get used to it because I think there's a lot of things. If you have this 34 apps, they're somewhere in here, and we kind of have to sort through all of them to get a feel for what we may need to create a report and be able to share that with the rest of your team. One more thing I'll cover here is just the positioning of the market itself, just for you to get a sense of where PostHog lands. I built this very simple 2x2 where we have left to right. That is how focus are there on a more technical audience, engineer, or on a non-technical audience. Then we have the breadth of tooling, how many options you have available on the y-axis. So you can see that PostHog does rank in the top right, so I do tend to go after a more technical engineer audience. A lot of the website kind of reflects that. The tool is still point and click, kind of what you see is what you get type interface, and it's not the most complex interface out there, but I do find it a little bit more technical than what you may find with something like a Mixpanel, which is much more focused on the non-technical audience. Amplitude kind of falls in between, where the interface feels a little easier, but they also kind of tend to go more after like a product audience. They kind of expect the audience to be a little bit more technical in how they use your tools. And something like Google Analytics, to be almost exclusively for marketers, it can still be quite overwhelming. We have to be honest about that. There's so many reports that many people find Google Analytics just completely too much. And you may find that too. And then we have something like Heap.io here, which again has been primarily built for a non-technical audience. The whole pitch has been auto capture. You just install heap and then you start to build reports. On the breadth of tooling, it's really hard to compete against PostHog, even though those 34 apps are not all individual apps in the way you might think about it. You do have a lot. The data pipelines, the AI, the product analytics, the market analytics. I think Amplitude and both Mixpanel are moving in that direction where they're starting to add more and more reports to their own platform. So both of them now have session replay. They both have heat maps. They both have A/B tests. I think Amplitude has a full A/B testing capability. Mixpanel less so. So PostHog may have 10, 15 features that completely do not exist in any of the other tools. And of course, analytics, even Heap, they just don't have those features yet. So in these startups, you find that you start with this all-in-one, and over time, you start taking pieces out and replacing with standalone tools. And that may also be a completely fine approach. Down here, I also want to mention the non-competitors, just to make sure we're clear that some things aren't really competing against PostHog. First, we have, this is the logo of Segment.com. This is the customer data platforms. PostHog does have like a light CDP capability, but I wouldn't consider it a full replacement for like a Segment.com or a Rudder Stack or an Particle. Those are the ones you're looking at. That may still be in your stack and just playing nicely with PostHog. Then the second logo is AppsFlyer, and this is actually the mobile attribution world. This is AppsFlyer, Adjust, Kochava. If you want to do any kind of mobile attribution, that is to understand where installs are coming from, you typically need them. That would play with PostHog. This logo here is Airbyte. This would be more like the data pipelines, ETL tools. You may have Airbyte here, Fivetran, Stitch. Again, not really competitors. I could definitely see that play nicely. PostHog does have ETL capabilities that may be completely fine for what you need. But if you have something a little more complex, then a standalone tool makes sense. The fourth icon is the data warehouses. You still need BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, Snowflake, Databricks. And then fifth, we have this icon as Brace. So this will be the communication tools like email, SMS notifications. I do think PostHog is starting to add some notifications again as part of it. In short, PostHog is a fantastic fit for startups. The breadth of tooling, the addition of new tools, I think that very distinct philosophy is fantastic. You kind of know what you're getting into. You can read about it. You get a sense of what a company is. The pricing philosophy, I think, can align a lot well with startups where you know what you're paying for and you kind of can predict where you might be in the next 6 or 12 months. I do have other videos on my channel where I do a similar detailed breakdown of like Mixpanel, Amplitude, I think Google Analytics 4, AppsFlyer. So you can get a feel for where the differences might be with each tool, and then make the best decision for your startup. Don't stop here though. I highly recommend you watch this next video that YouTube thinks will help you to continue to understand your startup's analytics and how to turn all your data into actionable insights. My name is Ruben, and I'll see you in the next video.